Okay, now we move to the. So today, we are focusing on. Let me just admit somebody. I'm so sorry. Every time I leave the. So today we are doing Learning Unit 1, the conceptualization of sustainable development. Is everybody seeing the screen in front of me? Because some people might see it, some people might not see it. So can you please let me know if you can all see it? You can either speak or show me thumbs.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay. So today we are looking at sustainable development and the debates and the controversies around its conceptualization. And we are also going to try and understand the intellectual crisis, what it means and how it relates to SD. And then we'll demonstrate knowledge of alternative solutions to the broader definitions of SD and its objectives. I'm sure you saw in one of the exam past papers, it had to do with alternative solutions to the broader definitions of SD and had to do with the intellectual crisis. So in this chapter, just make a mental note that if last year's paper could ask about the intellectual crisis, it seems that the sustainable development topic keeps coming out. I'm not sure about this exam. Okay. So in the introduction, okay, we are focusing on the concept of sustainable development. In this, we're going to be looking at the background to what prompted the first use of the concept, as well as where global development problems were debated, the issues that were discussed at the very first conference, and the discussion of the concept, presenting different definitions from traditionalists to those who offer alternative definitions. It says here we'll also study the reasons and rationale that led to what became known as an intellectual crisis in the debates on sustainable development and the alternatives that were advanced. Then SD has received much attention in scientific discourses, daily life practices, international negotiations, local policy measures, marketing, and in business. Then we move on to the actual beginning of the conceptualization, which was by Carl van Kollewitz from Europe in the year 1713, where he published this book on economical silviculture, and he was criticizing overexploitation and the devastation of the forests and emphasizing how the wood was meant to be used. Past development efforts had focused on the maximization of economic growth, which was achieved at the expense of natural resources. Now, the primary assumption was that development and economic growth could only be achieved by using available resources. These efforts undermined the aspects of the ecosystem's health and well-being and its integration in development efforts to ensure that the resources used today will still be available tomorrow. This resulted in resources. Please mute your mic. There's someone whose mic is glitching. This resulted in resources being overexploited, with some becoming extinct. Then the historical concept, it boils down to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature that had voted to draft a new program in 1969 at its plenary meeting in New Delhi, and it culminated a world conservation strategy, the joint work of IUCN, UNP, and the WWF. Then the strategy was presented on a campaign in 1980, and it demanded a new ethically responsible manner of dealing with the biosphere and its living resources, and connected with that the struggle against poverty in the countries of the global south. Now, in the document, which was titled The Living Resource Conservation for Sustainable Development, it's under the third point, it said that for development to be sustainable, it must take account of social and ecological factors as well as economic ones. And then the World Conservation Strategy began to now redefine the term conservation, which was said that it was defined as the management of human use of the biosphere so that it may yield the greatest sustainable benefits to present to present generations while maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspirations of future generations. Then a remarkable discovery was made during 1987 from the Brundtland formula, and it was anticipated word for word that in the same context, the vocabulary of providential theology and terminology of the 18th century forestry reappeared, while the modern term sustainable development appeared for the first time. And then the widely accepted definition of SD does come from the Brundtland Commission that was in 1987, which tells us that SD is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this report shaped the debates that are relating to SD today. And during the past two decades, the debate has changed. Now they're saying that there are new views, that although the concept of sustainability still has value, the issues underlying the world's changing political and environmental landscape should be addressed. So the key word here is the new views, and now we should focus on the political and environmental landscape issues. So here it also states that the first issue relates to how SD is conceptualized, and here the value of a plurality of perspective comes to the fore. I'm going to highlight the word plurality because it does get used in the e-reserve articles quite a bit. I think by Carrasco Miro, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so the first self-assessment activity had said to us that we must discuss the extent to which it is possible to achieve SD in the current post-Brundtland global order. And it told us that to answer this question, we must understand the context under which the Brundtland report was adopted and how the situation looks differently. Okay, so I said Brundtland was adopted because of increasing global concern about the environment and its degradation and poverty and inequality. The UN tasked World Commission on Environment and Development to propose sound strategies that would better economic growth with environmental protection. The Brundtland report introduced the concept of SD as a global call for change. This information from this paragraph is taken from the Brundtland World Commission report. The author or the person in charge of the conference wrote a good, I think it was 10 pages. So some of the information stems from him. So the Brundtland report introduced a concept of SD as a global call for change that highlighted intergenerational equity and the need for integrated approaches to development and environmental management. Although there are challenges from environmental problems that persist because of deforestation, overconsumption, and resource depletion, and also population growth. Sustainability still remains a global priority, even though new issues arise. One of the examples is climate change, inequality, and poverty. Progress, however, is there, such as a global awareness of climate change and energy transition and renewable energy. And then the SDGs were drafted by the Paris Climate Accord and the United Nations have also provided necessary frameworks for the action. This has resulted in a global adoption and a cooperation through the implementation of some policies and opportunities for effective resource efficiency. So in all of this, we should be able to pick out what the challenges are within the articles concerning this question, discuss the extent to which it is possible to achieve SD in the current post-Brundtland. So we need to state the challenges. And then I say that the realistic picture is this. Globally, SD in post-Brundtland era is near impossible to achieve, as backed up by Gorbachev, unless it addresses inequalities as stated by some of the scholars. They argue that SD today requires a systemic transformation, polycentric governance, and innovative approaches such as nexus and systems thinking rather than incremental reforms and shifting from short gain or long term. Now, Copilot says, while the vision of SD remains relevant, its realization depends on addressing structural inequalities, fostering global solidarity, and implementing innovative approaches such as system thinking and nexus models. Okay, so from this, there's an article, and the World Commission is very useful, and the Atkinson, all these articles are easily available just by downloading them on Google. And then now we move on to the controversies and complexities surrounding the definition of SD. So we know that the definition of SD is subject to debate and controversy, some of which has rendered the concept of SD ambiguous. Ambiguous means unclear or vague or having more than one possible interpretation. So the multi, inter, and transdisciplinary nature of the term has resulted in an intellectual crisis. This intellectual crisis is basically disagreements, uncertainty about ideas, concepts, or disagreements about the frameworks, and given rise to many different concepts. The complexity of current global challenges are interlinked and sometimes referred to as wicked problems. They do not have simple or linear answers. Linear answers are straightforward or step-by-step, and often require polycentric approaches. Polycentric approaches are governance or management that requires multiple centers of decision-making authorities, as opposed to monocentric approaches, which until recently the SDGs have dictated the SD agenda. Over the last 2 decades, there has been an increase in sustainability research, practice, and rhetoric. Green growth is almost a new buzzword in economic discussions. Please, can I just drink water? Give me a second, please. Real progress has been made in some areas. For example, the protection of the ozone layer or the growth of renewable energies in Europe. However, it appears that it is not enough because some of the problems, such as climate change, are not decreasing. And even in the clean and developed world of Europe, North America, and Japan, and Australia, old problems turn out to be very persistent and new problems arise. So these new problems are also arising from gas fracking, which is something that is quite big at the moment in the US, to particulate emissions and smog, and from groundwater pollution to over-fertilization of agricultural lands by intensive agricultures. These problems have led to new questions as to whether the way in which SD was conceived sufficiently highlights the existing development problems, or were the viewpoints heavily influenced by unrealistic, traditional, Western-led perceptions. Some scholars have highlighted the need to develop some SD theories in order to formulate realistic policy direction. So we can see that already there is an intellectual crisis because, you know, people are coming up with different ideas, especially the scholars. It tells us that the scholars are. So that's the part about the intellectual crisis. You can use the example of the scholars. And SD is unrealistic. Gorbachev propounds that the concept of SD is unrealistic. In his view, the idea of SD as presented in our common future is extremely humane and noble, and it has no alternative. But at the same time, this idea in the modern world looks very unrealistic. This is more a slogan than a scientific concept. SD is a global process. It is an ideal because our planet is a single balanced geo-ecological system. However, today, SD can theoretically only be achieved in a small number of highly developed post-industrialized countries. So this guy, now he's giving his argument. This is his argument about you know, that it can only be theoretically achieved in a small number of highly developed countries. And then he states that in developing countries, there can be no question of SD, you know. Therefore, SD can only be achieved at a global, planetary level. SD cannot be achieved in one country or only parts of a country. So that's his view. But this does not mean that all countries without exception do not need to implement environmental protection activity. On the contrary, it is necessary to carry out such activities everywhere. But all these measures are of a local nature. They will not become global, which means that this will not be a SD. I don't know if you guys are understanding what Gorbachev is saying, but Gorbachev has his view, and he now begins to move into the fact of the rational use of nature on a local level, and that he argues that we should use the term rational use of nature instead of SD. He demonstrates the basis for his arguments around key concepts such as the inevitability of SD crisis and how it should be better managed, the ecologization of economic development, post-industrialization, and environment performance index. So the second self-assessment activity, it says use practical examples to debate the validity of Gorbachev's arguments on why SD cannot be achieved globally. So I asked Copilot to just give us a bit of understanding on how you would go about just by looking. I have my opinion at the end, but I used them first. So he says that Gorbachev argues that SD is more of an ideal or slogan than a practical reality. He claims that SD can only be achieved in highly developed post-industrial countries and not globally due to disparities in technology, economic development, and resource consumption. Now he says, this is pilot, right? Let's examine the validity of these arguments using practical examples. The first argument, it says, SD is only possible in highly developed countries. Gorbachev states that SD requires advanced technologies, minimal resource consumption, and a strong knowledge economy, conditions found mainly in post-industrial nations. Then they begin to give examples, practical examples. Norway and Sweden. This is found in the article. All this information about the EPI, most of it, you find it in the Gorbachev article. And the reason why it's loaded here is because I had programmed it to be loaded so that you guys could get the realistic examples. Norway and Sweden rank among the top countries in the Environmental Performance Index with a high GDP per capita and a strong environmental policies. These nations have transitioned to renewable energy and circular economies, demonstrating that SD is achievable in such contexts. However, in contrast, South Sudan faces severe poverty, political instability, and a lack of infrastructure, making SD nearly impossible. These disparities support Gorbachev's claim that global SD is unrealistic in the near future. So you could use another example of another country in Africa outside of Gorbachev, and then you can substantiate by saying whatever Gorbachev says, you know? You don't have to use verbatim what is written here. You can choose your own countries. Argument 2, Global South faces systemic barriers. Most developing countries are still in industrial or pre-industrial phases with high population growth and dependence on resource-intensive industries. For instance, India struggles with balancing economic growth and environmental protection. Despite progress in renewable energy, coal remains a major source, contributing to pollution and climate challenges. Then it tells us about Nigeria, who faces deforestation and oil-related environmental degradation while trying to reduce poverty. These examples show that structural inequalities and resource dependencies hinder global SD. The other third argument is local projects. Gorbachev emphasizes that while local projects, example the rational use of nature, can mitigate crisis, they do not amount to global SD. For example, he uses Canada's Fraser River Basin Program. successfully managed water resources regionally, but such initiatives remain localized and cannot solve global sustainability challenges. These examples are in the article in Gorbachev. Counterpoint, global frameworks exist. Although Gorbachev's arguments are strong, global efforts like the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Accord show progress toward collective action. For example, the European Union Green Deal and Africa's Agenda 2063 aim to integrate sustainability into development plans. While challenges persist, these frameworks indicate that global SD is difficult, but not entirely impossible. And then it concludes that Gorbachev's argument that SD cannot be achieved globally is valid in the short term due to technological gaps, poverty, and resource dependency in developing nations. However, global cooperation and systemic transformation through polycentric governance and nexus approaches offers pathways to make SD more attainable in the long run. Okay, my notes. I said Gorbachev argues SD is an ideal rather than a practical reality, and that it's more of a slogan than a scientific concept. He argues that SD can only be achieved in highly developed post-industrial countries. Then I have to substantiate by providing an example. And then the realistic picture is that majority of the people in the global south live in countries with a lot of poverty, environmental and climate crises, and resource depletions. And then I have to give a practical example of what I'm saying there. And then I have to think of more examples why SD cannot be achieved globally. I can look at other notes, and also in my argument, I can support Gorbachev. So here, as you can see this highlighted in green, this is not for us. This is just me taking the article itself and adding it here, what I would need for the exam. So I'm going to skip past this green highlighted section, and we're going to move to the next section. So this is not part of the book. This is just part of the Gorbachev. You see, Gorbachev, why it says here, why sustainable development cannot be achieved at the global level. All this information, I took it from Gorbachev, as you can see, page 206. Sorry, I'm just scrolling past this into the next section. This is also from the Gorbachev article. This is the EPI. So all these countries that co-pilot was talking about, they're all here. So it's not making it up. It's taking from the information I put in here. And the Canadian program is also mentioned from the article on page 311. Okay. Now the next, the other one I'm going to skip is the Leonardo article, the Castello. Sorry, I'm skipping it. Okay. Now we're going to the section about SD has to be grounded in theory, which is on page 15 of the study guide. Solutions to the problems of the interconnected environmental, economic, social, and governance spheres cannot be reduced to mere technical engineering, linear and monocentric approaches, but must include social innovations, institutions, innovative governance mechanisms, and politics. These interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches, so interdisciplinary means two or more academic disciplines or fields of study, and transdisciplinary means integrating knowledge from multiple disciplines. So these two approaches necessitate bridging the science with policy and practice, the science-policy interface. That's quite an important keyword when you get a question concerning theory, grounding. This requires cooperation between scientists, policy and decision makers, and other societal actors, since the nature of the problems above is also due to a lack of governance and collective action. A bridge between natural and social sciences is required. Some scholars have proposed strategies to overcome several difficulties on the way to a theory of SD. So scholars are always intellectual crisis. I see another intellectual crisis concerning the SD as a theory. A theory of SD is difficult to construct because sustainability is not a generally scientific term. Rather, it is a societal and a political program. Its theory does not have to be analogous, which means similar, to a theory of physics. The discussion of theories of sustainable development is a first step towards sustainable transitions. In other words, how such societal transformations towards more sustainable lifestyles, more sustainable consumption and production patterns, and towards more social justice can be implemented. And then the self-assessment activity, it says in 3 paragraphs, discuss why it is necessary to have theories of SD. So I co-piloted why theories are necessary. And it tells you that theories of SD are necessary because sustainability is not a purely scientific concept, but I also have my view. Whenever I co-pilot, I have my view too. Because sustainability is not purely scientific concept, but a societal and political program. Unlike physics or chemistry, sustainability involves normative values, governance, and social justice. So the disadvantage of a co-pilot is it takes everybody's information and it makes it its own, right? It plagiarizes. So it's very important that if you're going to take something, you're going to have to reference it, you know, because all of this stuff is valid. It's true. It's correct based on, you know, what I'm reading. However, it's using it as its own. So without theoretical grounding, SD risks being reduced to a slogan rather than a practical framework. A theory provides clarity on the relationship between the environment, the social and economic dimensions, ensuring, let me just highlight this, ensuring that interventions are coherent and not fragmented. And then when you link theory into practice, theories help to bridge the gap between science, policy, and practice. Sustainable development challenges are complex and interconnected, requiring interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. I've already explained to you guys what those are. A theoretical foundation enables integration of natural sciences with social sciences, fostering innovative governance mechanisms and social innovations. This science policy interface is critical for addressing systemic issues such as climate change, poverty, and inequality. And then it talks about guiding sustainability transitions. Then it tells us that theories of sustainable development guide sustainability transitions, shifts towards more sustainable lifestyles, consumption patterns, and governance systems. They provide frameworks for evaluating trade-offs, setting priorities, and ensuring justice across generations. They use an example, the systems theory and nexus approaches are grounded in theoretical models that allow policymakers to understand linkages. Sorry, can I just highlight this? For example, system theory and nexus approaches are grounded in theoretical models that allow policymakers to understand interlinkages between sectors such as water, energy, and food. This theoretical underpinning ensures that sustainability strategies are dynamic, adaptive, and capable of addressing the wicked problems. This is also quite interesting. That theory actually helps to address the wicked problems. The wicked problems are mentioned in the study guide. Okay, so I say Gorbachev 2018. This is my notes. Gorbachev 2018 states that SD risks being reduced to a slogan if it is not grounded in theory. Theories are necessary as they help us to understand and explain knowledge of SD in different contexts. In SD, different theories help to conceptualize meanings and help to put order and structure. Theories of SD help us to understand complex issues around the concept and differentiate between for example, sustainability and what sustainable development means. Theories in SD are important because authors and scholars argue around the conceptualization, and theories bridge gaps between science, policy, and practice. That was just a tip that I got, but as you can see, it's look at that. That's taken straight from the author. That's why it's got inverted commas. Okay. Okay. And then this was the other article that I put here. It was the Enders and Moritz. We're going to scroll past this article to move to the next section. Okay. Now, the next section is the systems theory is the best approach to address SD challenges. So what I did was I had to now understand what is a systems theory and what is that about. Before I could formulate my own opinion, I needed to get it from my study assistant. So my study assistant tells me that a systems theory is an approach that views problems and solutions in terms of interconnected systems rather than isolated parts. It emphasizes that social, economic, and ecological systems are complex, dynamic, and interdependent, meaning changes in one part affect the others. What is it about? It's about holistic perspective. So systems theory promotes holism, which looks at the whole system rather than individual components. It looks at interlinkages and feedback loops. This focuses on relationships, feedback mechanisms, and how different sectors interact. Wood, water, energy, and food. That's the nexus, right? That's the nexus. Then it's about dynamic and adaptive management, which is that it recognizes that systems change over time, so solutions must be flexible and adaptive. And then it's about integrated governance. Then it talks about encouraging polycentric and participatory approaches to manage complexity. Now it tells me, why is it important for SD? SD challenges such as climate change, food security, and water scarcity are wicked problems that cannot be solved with linear one-dimensional solutions. Systems theory helps us to understand the trade-offs and synergies across the sectors. It helps us to design integrated policies that consider environmental, social, and economic dimensions. It moves from monocentric governance to polycentric governance for better resilience. Okay. Then Hoff states, this is part of the textbook, part of the study guide. There has been a strong interest in the global development literature in adopting a systems perspective to account for the interactions of socio-economic, socio-political, and ecological systems. So these words, socio-economic, socio-political, and ecological systems, they are very near the systems theory. You have to use it. If you're explaining the theory, the systems theory, you cannot leave that out. And yeah, however, the application of the systems theory has not been static, meaning it has not been changing. It has now evolved to the nexus approach. So the application of the systems theory has evolved to the nexus approach. And now the nexus is a Latin word for interlinkages. A nexus approach assesses interlinkages, which has to do with synergies and trade-offs across sectors and resources, and based on the evidence, promotes integrated management and governance. This is in the textbook, that paragraph. Now, again, I had to ask my study assistant to explain to me better what is a nexus approach so that I'm able to get a bigger picture of it. So what does it? It recognizes that resources such as water, energy, land, and food are interdependent. And then decisions in one sector, example, energy production, affect others, which they give an example of water availability for agriculture. They tell us that the approach promotes integrated management and governance to optimize synergies and minimize trade-offs across sectors. Now, why is the nexus approach important for SD? SD challenges are complex and interconnected, often called wicked problems. A nexus approach helps policymakers and planners, first of all, understand trade-offs. They use water for energy versus agriculture, and to design coherent policies that balance environmental, social, and economic goals. They also improve resource efficiency and resilience in the face of climate change and population. So it gives an example, and it tells us that in South Africa, coal mining for energy competes with water and land needed for agriculture in Mpumalanga. A nexus approach would analyze these interconnections and propose integrated solutions like renewable energy, water-saving irrigation, and land use planning. Okay, the development landscape consists of multiple complex, complicated, or simple systems and subsystems, with each providing functions and purposes with different degrees of intra and interconnectivity. This global picture suggests that adopting a systems mindset rather than a deterministic sectoral mindset is better for appraising the landscape and formulating dynamic hypotheses around critical and complex issues that are at play in the landscape. Then Armor Die. Armor Die is a book. I'm struggling to get this book. If anybody has this book, please can you inbox me privately on WhatsApp. I don't know how to get it, or can you tell me how to get it? Because I'd like to read through it. Armor Die 2018 presents the characteristics of systems thinking and reviews basic system dynamic tools, systems archetypes, and the different steps involved in the system dynamics modeling methodology. And then it talks about the hard systems approach. As a hard systems approach, system dynamics has unique characteristics that warrant its use when stimulating how the different sectors of the nexus unfold and interact when subjected to different inputs and constraints. In turn, the stimulations help decision makers to make management decisions and select interventions across the nexus and the community level. Then it tells us that he concludes with a discussion of the value added by using social network analysis and the importance of engaging in participatory modeling to develop system dynamic models. He advances that system thinking argues that some studies over the past 10 years have clearly demonstrated the benefits of using systems thinking and systems modeling, primarily when making decisions and developing systemic policy solutions at the regional or country scale, but not on a community-based level. And then for the activity 1.4, the video was not working. Am I correct? Did anyone watch the video for activity 1.4? Is it working? Okay. So the question is, there's no answer here. I just broke down the question. What are the central tenets of the systems theory in relation to SD? What are the main guiding principles of systems theory that help address SD challenges? So I needed to understand what are tenets. Tenets are principles, beliefs, doctrines that form the foundation of a theory, philosophy, or system. Tenets are, okay, it's the same. Systems theory would be holism, holistic perspective, interlinkages and feedback loops, dynamic and adaptive management. Those are part of the principles, and these are just keywords to what is within a systems theory. But you guys can do the homework for yourself and try find out what are the central tenets of a systems theory, because if it had to come out in the exam and you saw that you had time to answer it, it's going to be a bit, traumatic if they had to ask you for the central tenets. And we move on to the nexus model. So nexus models, firstly, what are nexus models? These are frameworks or tools used to analyze and manage the interconnections between multiple resource sectors. Okay, so the nexus models are more suitable and advanced improvements of systems theory. Since 2011, the development of hard system models of the complex and adaptive landscape in which the WEF, you guys know what that stands for, right? Water, energy, food, and I don't know what the E stands for, water, energy, land, food. Nexus unfolds and community development takes, sorry, let me read again. Since 2011, the development of hard system models of the complex and adaptive landscape in which the WEF, WEFE, WEF nexus unfolds and community development takes place has happened in parallel to formulations used in the closely related field of international development and aid. Okay. With some modifications, both approaches could be combined to integrate is a word here, systems and thinking into nexus studies and in the context of community development. Swilling 2020 argues that theoretical debates on SD have primarily evolved between the systems approach and other approaches. Okay. So theoretical debates on SD have this is what he argues, have evolved between the systems approach and other approaches. Proponents of the systems approach have also evolved from a hard to what has been termed a polycentric approach towards SD. Such an approach should go beyond the usual situation where economic considerations trump all others. The focus has also shifted to what is referred to as nexus themes. There are modeling approaches, frameworks for using the systems approach. According to Swilling, each nexus theme can be defined as a complexity of interrelated resource use and environmental impact issues that can be analyzed by reference to a particular cross-cutting process. Although all countries and cities are different, cities concentrate on the resource use and environmental impact issues. Food systems are globally, regionally, and locally constituted in ways that connect incredibly complex flow and nutrients, energy, food, waste, water, and materials. There are many variations of nexuses from water, energy, food, or food, energy, water, or food, energy, water, X, where the X component can be one of the other sectors, climate, land, energy, water strategies. And the integrated sustainable development goals planning model uses a system dynamic modeling methodology to explore development scenarios, linking strategies and policy as a country progresses towards reaching the 17 SDGs with projections as far into the future as 2030 and beyond. It should be noted that the food, energy, water, water, energy, land, food literature has mostly emphasized why an integrated or systems approach should be used to understand the nexus dynamics. This in turn has helped decision and policymakers to become aware that synergies and trade-offs between sectors of the nexus need to be considered in the management and allocation of water, energy, land, and food resources. And secondly, decisions at one spatial or temporal scale may impact decisions at other scales. Finally, it has become clear that the food, energy, water, water, energy, land, food nexus cannot be separated and analyzed independently from the landscape in which it unfolds. And now we get to go to the next activity, and it says, choose any one nexus theme and debate its importance in relation to the problems in the community of which you live. So what I did was, I made it choose my area. I had done some work yesterday on it. However, coming from an area called Craigle Park, it said the water energy food nexus. It used the water energy food nexus. And for this particular activity, I've given you guys two examples. I've given you an example of an affluent area and an example of an informal settlement so that you understand how the nexuses work and how the themes work. And so here for the water energy food nexus, is a highly relevant to Craighall Park because this community faces interconnected challenges related to water scarcity, energy dependency, and food security. You can literally do this according to your own community. It's not going to be the same as this one. Addressing these issues in isolation would lead to inefficiencies and trade-offs. So an integrated approach is essential. So the first thing it talks about is water challenges in Craighall Park. Firstly, there's a high water demand. Craighall Park is an affluent suburb with large gardens and swimming pools, which significantly increase water consumption. And then it stresses on municipal supply. Johannesburg already faces water scarcity due to climate variability and aging infrastructure. High consumption in wealthy areas exacerbates inequality and resource stress, and then how this impacts on food systems. Water scarcity affects urban agriculture and food gardens, reducing local food resilience. And then the nexus perspective is the water saving measures. Example, rainwater harvesting, greywater recycling, and it must be integrated with energy efficient pumping systems and sustainable landscaping to reduce pressure on municipal water. And then with the energy challenges, this is on coal-based electricity. Craighall Park relies heavily on Eskom's coal-powered grid, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And then load shedding. Frequent power cuts disrupt daily life and increase reliance on diesel generators, which further harm the environment. We don't use generators. We use backup inverters. Maybe 1 or 2 houses out of like 30 will use generators. So I'm correcting what this thing is saying. Nexus perspective, transitioning to solar energy for homes and water heating reduces carbon emissions and lowers electricity costs. Solar-powered boreholes or pumps can also support water security. Then in terms of the food security issue, it talks, while residents generally have access to food, rising costs and supply chain disruptions, example droughts or energy crisis, affect affordability and sustainability. It talks about the urban agriculture initiatives are limited, yet they could reduce dependency on external food systems. So here, the nexus perspective is encouraging community food gardens irrigated with harvested rainwater and powered by solar pumps creates a closed loop system that improves resilience. So nexus is like your way out. It's an amelioration. Why the nexus approach matters. Integrated solutions. Instead of tackling water, energy, and food separately, the nexus approach ensures that intervention in one sector do not harm another. Climate adaptation. Johannesburg faces climate risks, droughts, heat waves. Nexus planning helps optimize resource use and build resilience. Then the other one is equity and sustainability. Reduces resources stress and promotes fair access while lowering environmental impact. Now, the practical recommendations for Craighall Park would be to install solar panels and energy efficient appliances to reduce reliance on coal. It would be to implement rainwater harvesting systems and greywater recycling for the gardens. And it would be to promote urban food gardens using water efficient irrigation and renewable energy. And the other one is to encourage community awareness programs on the water, energy, food nexus to foster collective action. And now we are doing a second example, doing a water, energy, food nexus. We are now using it for informal settlements in Diepsloot to Alexandra because these communities face, no, let me not offend Alexandra. Is Alexandra an informal settlement? I don't think it is. I think it's just a township. Because these communities face severe challenges in accessing clean water, reliable energy, and affordable food. These issues are deeply interconnected, and addressing them in isolation often leads to unintended consequences. So nexus has to be addressed connectedly. You cannot isolate. You cannot just look at water energy. You have to look at the water, energy, and food and how they connect. So the water challenges. Limited access to clean water. Informal settlements often rely on communal taps or water tankers, which are unreliable and insufficient for household needs. Then the sanitation issues. Poor water infrastructure leads to health risks such as cholera and diarrheal diseases. The impact on food security. Lack of water limits small-scale gardening and urban agriculture, reducing local food production. Then the nexus perspective would be to improve water access through community boreholes, rainwater harvesting, and grey water recycling can support food gardens and reduce the health risks. These solutions should be integrated with energy-efficient pumping systems. And then the energy challenges, they have an unreliable electricity supply. Many households lack formal grid connections and rely on illegal connections or paraffin stoves, which are unsafe and polluting. And then the load shedding impact, frequent power cuts disrupt food storage, refrigeration, and water pumping systems. So the nexus perspective would be to introduce solar mini grids or solar home systems that can provide clean energy for lighting, cooking, and water pumping. This reduces reliance on unsafe fuels and supports food preservation. And also gas stoves. You get the 2-plate gas stoves now. That could have been included here. Food security issues, high food prices. Residents spend a large portion of income on food due to lack of local production and dependence on external supply chains. Limited space for agriculture. Informal settlements have high population density, making traditional farming difficulty. And also, the land is not suitable. Some people live on gravel. They just build anyway. Nexus perspective, promoting vertical gardens, container gardening, and community food gardens irrigated with harvested rainwater and powered by solar pumps can improve food availability and nutrition. Why the Nexus approach matters? Well, for the integrated solutions, it would be tackling water, energy, and food together to ensure that interventions in one sector do not harm one another. The climate adaptation. Informal settlements are vulnerable to droughts and heat waves. Nexus planning helps to build resilience. And then the social equity reduces resource stress and promotes fair access to essential services. Practical recommendations for informal settlements to install solar-powered boreholes. That's very unrealistic for a reliable water supply. It's too expensive. Implement rainwater harvesting systems for household and garden use. Develop community food gardens using water-efficient irrigation and renewable energy. I think a practical recommendation for informal settlements is tanks. We all know that tanks. Those what do you call them? Jojo tanks. Those green tanks that they use in the villages. Launch awareness programs on resource conservation and integrated planning. And that brings us to the end of the Nexus. And now we are moving to the next theme. Oh yeah, the material, the feedbacks. These articles, some of them, if you want to find them quickly, you just highlight here and you just paste them to Google and you'll find them. The importance of decoloniality in SD. It has been argued that SD and the concept of development tend to be Eurocentric, which is a dominance of Western perspectives in defining global concepts. That's Eurocentric. Because of their linkages to the capitalist system of production and colonialism, there has been a call by scholars from the Global South to have the voices of the Global South and their interpretations of their realities recognized. These sentiments echo across discussions on matters of definitions of the concepts such as knowledge. Sorry. I was turning on the light. I lost my chain of thought. These sentiments echo across discussions on matters of definitions on the concepts such as knowledge, scholarship, policy development approaches, rationale, and application. Decolonizing the world's responses to pressing issues of sustainability, such as climate change, is crucial to achieving the transformation of global economies and societies. The old ways of tweaking the system by slotting into mainstream processes those elements of indigenous worldview that seem to fit most comfortably does not work. Valuing the colonial system of neoliberalism and runaway capitalism over those proven sustainable paradigms will lead to no lasting solutions. So this is some of the stuff I'm highlighting so that if I need to argue in an essay, then it's easier for me to find. Instead, we need to flip the script and start providing spaces wherein indigenous thinking and worldviews provide the fundamental framework and non-indigenous ideas that align sufficiently with indigenous principles may be incorporated as appropriate. However, we must also be cognizant that decolonial approaches differ for different experiences, from post-settler colonialism to race and gender perspectives. The Carrasco Mirror article is very rich in this decolonial. If you want to nail this, you must just read this article. Carrasco Mirror introduces the decolonial approach to SD. She focuses on questions of power, colonialism, and capitalist relations in order to understand and disrupt the dominant discourse and the project of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. She analyzes the mainstream sustainable development conceptual framework, and she argues that it has become profoundly problematic, even seriously unthinkable, to do good work under the current development framework, with its modernist and extractivist premises of bounded individualism and human exceptionalism. I wish I had put the meanings of extravagance. I think you guys can Google what extravagance and all those words mean so that it doesn't seem intimidating, because it seems intimidating right now. She opines that there is urgent need for new discourses and modes of representation that shift resource-related debates to open platforms for engaged, decolonized, and decentralized public discourse. She draws on feminist, indigenous, decolonial art, and critical environmentalist knowledges. She proposes an ecosysteme of care as a way to think beyond the dead end of sustainable development, green capitalism, and to resurrect a limit to growth and sustainability of life discourse and practices. In this sense, ecosystems of care open a radical way of imagining the economy and economics as multiple, I need to highlight this, multiple inter-ecodependent polyvocal, and as bringing together social political insights in a contextual and situated manner. Okay, so let's quickly find out what this article is actually about. So the introduction of this article critiques the Carrasco article. It critiques the dominant discourse of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and it highlights its problematic reliance on modernist, extractivist premises of bounded individualism and human exceptionalism. It questions the necessity of specifying SD and challenges the assumption that development is the only solution to sustainability and the climate crisis. And then the second section of this article, it says it is not about carbon. This section argues that the current sustainable development paradigm derived from the 1987 Brundtland Report prioritizes economic growth over ecological and cultural considerations. And it critiques the assumption that development policies must focus on growth for global well-being, ignoring the cultural and ecological costs of such growth. It highlights the failure of sustainable development narratives to address the deeper issues of global economic power systems and histories of colonialism and exploitation. The third section of this article tells us that it critiques the three dimensions of the SD framework, which are environmental, economic, and social, and it argues that they sustain economic exploitation, industrial models, and ecological destruction. It highlights the reduction of nature to economic value, the problematic reliance on green capitalism, and the failure to address the root causes of poverty and inequality. And then the fourth section is the eco-sciences of care. This section introduces the concept of eco-sciences of care as a decolonial alternative to the dominant sustainable development framework. It emphasizes the need to center the sustainability of life, interdependence, and care in economic thinking. Eco-sciences of care challenge the anthropocentric and capitalogenic assumptions of sustainable development and propose a pluralistic, biocentric, and ethical approach to sustainability. Okay, so the final remarks about this is the conclusion rejects hope as a political strategy and critiques the modernist capitalogenic narrative of sustainable development for perpetuating ecological and social harm. It calls for a shift towards eco-sciences of care to reimagine economies and create equitable, ethical, and sustainable futures. And that was the Carrasco Mirror article. Okay, and the last one was self-assessment activity 1.6, discuss the relationship between the conceptualization of SD and its embeddedness within Eurocentrism and capitalism. I still need to make notes for this. So I didn't answer this. However, from the feedback, there are articles that I still need to look at so that I can open my brain a little bit more. Although I don't have time, I might just even skip them. And then we conclude this article. In this unit, you were introduced to the concept of SD. This included the background to what prompted the first use of the concept, as well as the issues that were discussed at the very first conference where global development problems were debated. The discussion of the concept presented the different definitions from the traditionalists to those who offered alternative definitions. You were also introduced to the reasons and rationale behind what led to what became known as an intellectual crisis in the debates on sustainable development and the alternatives that were advanced. You have learned that some of the political, economic, social, and environmental conditions that prevailed for more than 40 years after SD was first discussed have also not changed, and that hence new approaches are also emerging. I have a suggestion here, right? So if you want to make your notes for the exam easier, you could maybe, for example, you see here, it says alternative definitions. You can maybe in brackets, you can write down the alternative definition, what was said, and then you can give a reason of the intellectual crisis that was mentioned, so that you are able to, like here, for example, I wish I could have done this, but I'm willing to share it. I'm willing to share how I would have done the notes. So here I would have put like the alternative definition offered by the different authors in the book. So I'd say this person said this and this and this, and then I'd reference that. And then I would also state the scholars, what one of the scholars are saying, just for notes, just for notes. And then I'd also learn political that was first also changed. And then I would also try and make an example about how they have changed or who's saying something about this, etc. That way I know that I have a little bit of meat for in case I feel like answering an SD question that would align to this information concerning alternative definitions. There's a screen that I would have loved to share with you concerning the test, the past paper. However, okay, sorry, this is learning unit 2. Okay, let me quickly, can I stop the recording now so that I can try share another screen? Are you guys still okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
we're still okay.
Okay, I hope I'm not boring you guys. Okay, stop recording. Okay.